Welcome to the Armored Soil Podcast, brought to you by the Renville County SWCD, where we look to bring real-life information on all things sustainable resources and agriculture. We believe that soil is invaluable and that protecting our soil is the key to sustaining all aspects of life. Please like and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. The information you will hear about is personal experience and is no way economic or agronomic advice. If you are interested in implementing these practices or techniques you hear about, we recommend you reach out to your agronomist and our CS office or local conservation district for ways to work them into your operation. For more information about our liability or podcast, please visit our website at renvilleswcd.com. Welcome back to the Armored Soil Podcast. Today we have Joe Ailts from Northwest Wisconsin. He's an independent agronomist with a passion for soil health, and he will be talking today about establishing cover crops, soybeans, and potentially some small grain stuff and different economics on all that. Joe, how are we doing today?
Good morning, Kyle. Thanks for having me. Beautiful October morning here in Northwest Wisconsin. Just came off of a wonderful Northern Lights show and a killing frost, so all is good.
Yeah, it was quite the aurora borealis last night, that's for sure. How's harvest progressing in Wisconsin and Minnesota? It's October 8th here today, and a lot of soybeans are out, and a lot of corn's starting to be picked pretty quick as well.
Yeah, same in our neighborhood here. We're probably halfway through the beans and guys just starting to dip into the corn. We had an incredibly hot end of our Septembers. I'm sure you guys did too. And while we watch these moistures come down, drop like a rock. So the corn and the beans are much drier than expected in this neighborhood.
And that's what we had here too. How'd your August and September kind of shape up with moisture wise? We've been bone dry since kind of the end of July, early August.
So we had a couple of nice 1-inch rains during the month of August, which built a lot of high expectation into that bean crop. But then the water completely shut off in the month of September. Here at my location in the Richmond, Wisconsin area, we had 4/10 of rain the entire month of September. According to the Weather Service, it was the hottest and driest September on record. So I think that took a lot of the wind out of the sails in the soybean crop as they were trying to finish out, put those last few beans on the top pods there. Just couldn't quite get there because of how quickly we ran out of water.
Yeah, so that's kind of a good segue into what my first question here is a little bit on soybean RM and the different RMs for soil health. Have you done any experimenting and changing your RM or with any of your clients to get more covers established in that to hopefully help with these more hotter Septembers we're probably going to start seeing to keep that moisture in the ground so that they might have some reserves in the soil?
Yeah, this is a topic of particular interest for me personally. Prior to becoming an independent agronomist 3 years ago, I worked for a major seed brand for 8 years prior to that as a field agronomist and had the opportunity to collect a large data set of soybean plot yield data, which then I was able to parse out by relative maturity and planting date. And over that 6 years of planting data, multiple seasons, many locations spanning across northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, accumulating over 6,000 data points, I was able to tease out that the early maturing soybeans, when planted early, and to put that into a relative perspective, early for us here in Northwest Wisconsin would be the last week in April, was the highest yielding cohort of all the different cohorts of beans that I looked at in various combinations of planting date and relative maturity. Just to say that again, so the emphasis is noted there, the earliest maturing cohort, which included beans from the 0.4 maturity group up to about 0.8, that would be considered early for even our northern territory, was the highest yielding cohort of all the different cohorts. And so that gave me some degree of confidence that there are indeed early maturing, relative maturity soybeans in the marketplace that can keep up with later maturing soybeans to the point where I believe we can plant these, not give up significant bushels, get them harvested earlier, which then, as you alluded to, allows us to come back and put in cover crops in early to mid-September versus early to mid-October when they more traditionally get planted. And as we know with cover crops, getting them established early is one of their keys to success. So it's been really interesting to see this project bear some fruit. And I think that this is a practice that can be adopted that doesn't cost you anything, especially in terms of bushels, which is really kind of neat.
What do you think the the biggest roadblock is in getting producers to kind of adopt that logic and think, let's get let's get our soybeans in the ground before May, and we can get them off before September.
Yeah, so two things I think that I've experienced become somewhat roadblocks to that. The first one being is that farmers are not just wired historically to plant their beans before the corn. However, all the best data that we've seen out of major universities as well as on-farm research has shown us repeatedly that early planted soybeans put you deeper in the money than any other practice that you can adopt on the farm. It pays. It really does. Sean Conley's research out of University of Wisconsin has shown repeatedly that for every day in May that one delays soybean planting is roughly a half bushel of yield potential you give up. So if there's 30 days in May and you wait for the entire month of May, you're giving up 15 bushel of bean potential just by planting date alone. So that's the first obstacle I see. The second obstacle I see is that when it comes to selecting bean varieties, I think farmers again are wired to think that this acts like corn, where the longer maturity you select, the more yield potential is there. We certainly know that is true for corn. I think that's an easy one to accept, and there's nothing to refute that. However, with soybeans, that logic isn't play out the same exact way. Yeah, there's a positive correlation between relative maturity and soybean yield, but that relative maturity correlation is not nearly as significant as it is for corn. There's just not as much bang for your buck there. And so that same data set I've used to identify that these early maturing, early planted beans can yield potentially higher than other cohorts also applies to this relative maturity across the entire spectrum. Now, at very large degrees of difference, let's talk like a 1.0 bean versus like a 3.0 bean that you'd plant way down in Missouri. Yeah, there's a big yield separation there based on relative maturity. But when you condense down the maturity separation, let's say the difference between an 0.1 and like an 0.5 or something like that, just a half a maturity group, that difference isn't so significant that I think you're giving up significant potential yield. But the savings in terms of time, harvest time, is pretty darn significant. The rule of thumb there is that for every 0.1 relative maturity, there's 1 day of harvest potential. So if you look at the difference between a 1.0 bean and a 1.5 bean, that's 5 or 0.5 relative maturity units. That's 5 days of potential harvest. And every single day in September, as we know, or early October, is of significant value, especially as it relates to getting covers established.
And what are you seeing the most significant? What cover crops are being established most successfully after soybean harvest?
Sure. Up here in Northwest Wisconsin, because our time frame for getting covers established is so narrow, cereal rye has been the go-to. I would say cereal rye probably is 90% or more of the cover crop species that are planted up here. Some farmers have dabbled with sprinkling in some other species, such as some turnips or some radish or other types of brassicas with the cover crop rye. However, our experience shows that there just isn't enough growing season to really get them firmly established to reap the benefits that we think some of these other species can provide. So I'm not so sure there's a good way for us to cheat that system. If we can get the covers in the ground early September, I think we can start dabbling with some of these other species because there's enough time to establish there to get some benefit out of them. Really, the only other way for us to be able to exploit other species, such as a legume or other types of species, is after small grains. That really opens up the window. But there we're talking, obviously an August establishment time frame versus September.
Are you working with any producers that are like broadcasting cover crop seed or flying on any cover crops into beans at like 10 to 15% leaf drop in the hopes that, we'll be harvesting these soon and hopefully catch a rain that we can, obviously this year it wouldn't have worked very well, but hopefully that they might survive long enough in the ground for harvest?
Yeah, a number of producers up in this part of the world have historically used aerial application in standing soybeans as a means to get their rye flown out. And so many years past, it has been a very successful practice. And now with more UAV or drone operators around the area, they too are looking to establish covers in the standing crop. And so, like you said, any other year but this year, it has worked fabulously. But this year it has been it's been a real struggle. You can find a couple of seeds out there at germinate, but I think there's a lot of them just waiting for the rain when it finally does come.
So we were really wet early on. I'm assuming you guys were too in Northwest Wisconsin, where it kind of pushed planting back quite a bit, or a lot of replanted areas. What did you see in your neck of the woods on the soybean and corn crop, where on where you had conventional fields next to people practicing soil health in whether they had to replant or drowned out areas were less, anything like that? Did you see a big difference in the conventional versus soil health?
Yeah, I certainly believe we have seen a big difference, and that big difference has to do with infiltration rates. We know that in areas where you've had long-term no-till plus covers, the infiltration rate of the water moved through the profile in such a way that it did not allow for these anaerobic conditions. And so, a couple of interesting anecdotes I've run into recently, some farmers have relayed to me, is that as they're dipping down into the ravines and the low spots, historically where you'd see the yield monitor climb up into unbelievably high levels of yield. They're not seeing that this year. Even though the vegetation is there and it looks like they're good beans, when they dip into that with the combine, they're watching the yield numbers drop significantly. And so I think that these types of circumstances show where you've got hard pans underneath the soil surface, where the soil's been beaten up and it's tight down there and the water cannot drop down through the soil profile. And in those circumstances where you created these anaerobic conditions, I believe that the soybean nodules really suffered. These microbes that create nitrogen in the soybean root system, they need air as well. And if those things got drowned out because the water simply was not infiltrating through the soil profile, I think that allowed the plant to grow vegetatively, but it just wasn't able to meet the nitrogen demands of filling the pods. And so there is some loose correlation that I'm observing between those types of circumstances and various types of soil management practices. And again, just to kind of put a bow on that, where I'm seeing good no-till cover crop practices over the long term, the infiltration rates were much higher. The water could move out of that soil profile, and I think those crops were healthier because of that.
Well, you think about it too if your soybean nodules aren't getting enough oxygen because we have that anaerobic condition, we're also our biology in the soil and all of our invertebrates that are feeding our soil, feeding our roots, our worms, they probably don't have the proper conditions as well, and they're just going to die too. So you're not only not allowing the plants to survive, but you're not allowing any of the biology to survive in the soil, where if you have that infiltration rates, you're able to allow that biology to prosper throughout the growing season, even and potentially even not really be set back by a heavy rainfall.
Yeah, 100%. And I was able to ground truth this a bit by running a few Haney tests prior to side dress application. And one of the things that I enjoy about the Haney test is you look at the respiration value on there. So soil respiration, how microbes give off CO2 is a good proxy for the biological, livelihood of the soil. And this was coming into late June, early July. After the rains had stopped, the soils were still saturated. I was out collecting Haney samples across many of the fields that I walk, and I found that in those areas that were saturated, that soil respiration value were some of the lowest numbers I've ever measured on the Haney test before. And so it corroborates your idea there that all of biology gets snuffed out a bit if there isn't oxygen to breathe, and therefore it's not doing the wonderful things that it would normally provide to a growing crop.
Yeah, and there's just so much research out there that shows that if you have that biology, you're able to tap into the natural nutrients that are available in the soil. I mean, there's so much nitrogen available and phosphorus and potassium available just in your soil, but you need that biology to eat it, digest it, ruminate it out to allow your plant roots to do it or to utilize it. And I think that's the biggest key that is sometimes missed on this, is that like our soil has so much life in it. We just need to figure out ways to, one, sustain the life, but also add to that life to make it prosper. And I think this whole idea around decreasing your soybean RM to allow a cover crop, and not only just cereal rye, but maybe a turnip or a kale or radish or something else that can enhance that biological activity for longer in the growing season, is a way that we can get that naturally to happen and not have to rely on synthetics as much. Obviously, we'll still need some, but we don't need our plant to need to be spoon fed throughout the year to survive.
Yeah, totally agree, especially if you've got biology working on your side. So one of the things that I stumbled across here throughout the growing season I found really quite interesting was in regard to which types of microbes preferentially colonize the brassica family of plants. So that would be things like radish and kales and turnips and such. Historically, I've been a little bit looking down upon these brassicas, trying to really figure out what purpose do they serve in a cover crop blend beyond just their ability to put down a big taproot, which unfortunately we just can't seem to get the benefit of if we don't plant them early enough. But the thing that I came across that really caught my attention and has my perspective changing is that it seems as though these brassicas, which do not colonize mycorrhizal fungi, do, however, preferentially colonize another class of fungi called trichoderma. And the trichoderma species of fungi are really quite interesting because they are known for their willingness to gobble up fusarium. Now, fusarium includes a whole bunch of plant pathogens that are nasty towards both corn and soybeans. And so now, if you've got a type of cover crop that preferentially colonizes a class of good guy fungi that preferentially eats the bad guys, I mean that really is intriguing to me. And now it certainly defines the role of brassicas in these blends to be much more important if we can help raise native populations of trichoderma in our soils.
Yeah, that's really interesting to see that you're not only getting soil health benefits by increasing your infiltration, but you're also getting benefits on the bacterial side, on the biologic side, that it's all just one working cycle. And it just is fascinating. The world of soil is just fascinating to me, and how we can just make little tweaks to our operations, and not even big ones really, and you can really activate that biology to get it working for you and get your soil working for you instead of against you. And so that kind of leads into my next question here is what big equipment changes or even small equipment changes are you seeing producers needing to make to, one, successfully establish cover crops in soybeans, and two, kind of look at um, changing their soybean RM?
Yeah, sure. So I think the most indispensable tool that I believe a farm can add as they start to go down this soil health journey is bringing a drill into the operation. Ideally, it's a no-till drill, but I think any drill can do the job as long as it's a good drill. And I think that these are indispensable tools, not only for doing a good job of getting covers established, but also then it kind of gives you the open door to say, where does potentially a small grain fit into this rotation as well? Because obviously that tool can be used for both small grain production as well as cover crop seeding. And here's an interesting little factoid that a farmer recently shared with me who he does grow cover crop rye for his own operation. He told me this year that his his rye for grain will be his most profitable crop this year. So he sells the rye that he harvests to other farmers in the area to plant as cover crop rye, but he also bales the straw and sells that to local dairies as well. And when he does the numbers on this crop, taking the amount of inputs and then tallying up the revenue, he said his rye will be his most profitable crop this year. So I think there's some signs out there that are pointing towards making it very lucrative to think about where cover crops and small grains fit into the rotation, especially if they can become some of the most profitable crops that are on a family farm.
So would you say rye is your biggest small grain opportunity that you're seeing in Northwest Wisconsin?
Yeah, certainly rye is the biggest opportunity just because we've got a lot of folks who have adopted cover crop. And given that that is our staple cover crop here, there is a robust market for cover crop rye. However, we do have a market for oats, winter wheat, and barley as well. And I see those markets expanding every year as more operations adopt small grains and more markets open up to use the outcomes of these small grain operations as well. So it's a flourishing market, and we're happy to see it continue to grow.
What do you think the biggest advantage of adding a small grain into operation to your system, not even from an economic side of things, but also a soil health side of things?
Yeah, just it opens up so many incredible opportunities. I think the benefits are almost too numerous to list here. The one thing that I appreciate about that is Joe Lauer's research out of the University of Wisconsin. He was Wisconsin's corn agronomist for 37 years before he retired here recently. His research focused on crop rotations in row cropping systems. And what his 30 years of research demonstrated is that a corn, soybean, wheat rotation or small grain of any type was the most economical and agronomical advantageous system of all the systems that he studied. There is something about putting a small grain into a corn and soybean rotation that disrupts some pathogen cycles and or offers some other types of soil health benefits that I'm not completely sure we fully understand. But the outcome of this showed that not only did you see increases in the small grain yield, because of course that was being split up with other rotational crops, but you also saw soybeans and corn yield increase as a result of putting small grains in these rotations as well. So there's some sort of ongoing effect, positive impact of having a small grain in the rotation that positively impacts corn and soybeans as well. So I think that is one of the major aspects to consider when thinking about these small grains and whether or not they fit into a rotation. The other piece is one that we'd already discussed, is that if you put a small grain in the rotation and you harvest that late July, early August, it opens up the window for all kinds of fun to be had with your cover crop species blends. Perhaps the most lucrative of which is potentially even establishing a legume, which then has the potential to overwinter and build meaningful nitrogen for the following year corn crop, if that's what you choose to plant after that small grain harvest.
Yeah, I think that just speaks to the benefit of diversity, whether it's just crop diversity, that even just adding another grain to your harvest, small grain, or to your operation, just unlocks a lot more potential as well. Even if you can't get a 3 species or a 5 species cover crop mix, like if you can just take a year and be like, all right, I'm going to grow winter wheat or cereal rye or barley, it's going to add enough that it shocks the system. We're going to activate some other form of microbiology in the soil that will just help our other cash crops going forward.
Yeah, totally agree. And to put some numbers behind the value of this type of a system where we think about doing something either for the soil health or the nitrogen fixing aspect of it, I have become more and more interested in performing these cover crop biomass tests where we go out in the spring prior to termination. We collect a defined area of cover crop biomass, ship it off to a lab, have it analyzed for every nutrient under the sun, similar to a forage analysis, and then we can kind of see what this cover crop was able to do in terms of nutrient sequestration. So a whole bunch of really neat insights have come out of this work that we've done here locally. Let's quickly talk about the nitrogen piece. For anyone who's establishing a legume, let's say mid-August, and it overwinters, comes back to life and grows for a couple of weeks before termination the following spring, I have found upwards of over 60 units of nitrogen are captured in that above ground biomass. Now, it doesn't look like a lot because you're talking 6 to 8 inches of regrowth of whatever your legume is, whether it be a clover, hairy vetch, alfalfa. Doesn't look like it's a big hairy jungle out there, but it's concentrated. It's concentrated in nitrogen, and 60 units of above ground biomass, prior to termination early May, to me sounds like a number that's really quite lucrative. So that's something I think has been proven. We've now ground truth that nitrogen can be built even up here in Northwest Wisconsin. In regards to how much nitrogen credit you can take for that, I think that's up in the air. There are some who say that you can take the full 60 units of that if you just leave it on the top and don't incorporate it, which of course we recommend doing is to leave it on the top. There are others who say you got to cut that number in half. So then you take your 60, cut it in half, you're down to 30. Well, it goes, well, that's a little less interesting. I probably buy it cheaper than for that. But I think that there's still a lot of debate to play out in regards to how many total units we can take. And again, in healthy functioning systems where you got quick turnover of that biomass on the top, leaning towards taking that full credit, I think becomes a much more plausible opportunity. Now, I'm curious to see what kind of questions you got. We've also looked at running cover crop biomass tests just on regular old cereal rye. And so just kind of curious, what is rye capable of sequestering if it's planted late September or what have you, and then terminated late April, early May up in these parts of the world. And last year went out and captured a cover crop biomass test on rye that was 8 to 10 inches tall, the perfect height for termination, just to see, what's in there. And so when that test result came back, I was astounded to find that there were 30 units of nitrogen in that 8-inch tall rye. And it had a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 14 to 1, which
Holy
again
cow.
is quite incredible
Yep.
because, perception out there that rye ties up nitrogen and boy, you can't do that, put your corn into that because it's going to gobble up all your nitrogen. I disagree with that. If rye is terminated at the proper stage, again, 8 to 10 inches, somewhere in that neighborhood, we are finding that the C to N ratio is favorable enough that is actually giving nitrogen back to that corn crop versus sequestering it. So interesting insights there that I did not expect to see just by performing a couple of these tests here locally.
And yeah, that is just crazy that you're getting that nitrogen from a small grain, that it's not a legume and you're getting it from a small grain. Wow. The nitrogen thing is always fascinating to me because if you talk to local co-ops or some agronomists, it's going to be, oh, your corn needs more nitrogen. And we're seeing just anecdotally from farmers that I've talked with in the area that when they start implementing cover crops and no-till, within the first couple years, they're able to cut their nitrogen program down a quarter, and they're slowly cutting more and more each year and not seeing any yield hits. And I think everybody knows how expensive nitrogen is, and that's the biggest way producers could put money back in their pocket by not having to spend so much more on fertilizer. And when you go into a no-till system or even a strip-till system, you're cutting your passes. Yes, you're seeding with a drill, so you're still running a tractor, but you don't need that heavy horsepower to pull a ripper or pull a field cultivator. You can have a smaller tractor, just pull your drill, and you're not getting the levels of compaction that you're going to get when you have that big, heavy tractor pulling those tillage implements. But I just think the nitrogen thing is one that we miss. We always talk in the soil health like, oh yeah, like less passes, less time, less diesel, less fuel. But I think we're really missing in the soil health when we sell this is what you're going to see the most benefit is by reducing the amount of fertilizer that you need.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree with that comment, and appreciate the fact that there are now more tools available for us to begin to quantify and measure the way that some of these practices are able to pay off. And I think that's always been perhaps the challenge with some of these soil health practices is that, we know it feels good, it feels right to do these things, but how do we know we're actually getting some sort of measurable benefit out of that? Surely we can always look to yield at the end of the season, but there's so much more than yield that I think is taking place here that help us shape some of the decisions we make. To your point, the reduction of fertilizer, because there is a biologically functioning system facilitated by cover crops to enable us to reduce P or K or nitrogen applications? Yeah, absolutely. And again, we've got tools now where we can measure some of this. One more quick anecdote to help elaborate on this point. The farmer that rents our family's 220 acres here, he's a no-tiller and a cover cropper, and he has traditionally put out his fall DAP as well as potash following soybean harvest in front of next year's corn crop. And so I know that that can raise concerns about fall spread fertilizer, whether or not that stuff runs away and leaves the acres. Well, if it's put on with a cover crop, and this farmer, he spreads his rye with his fall P and K application, so it's all broadcast over the top. Our experience was that if this rye establishes robustly, it's actually going to start to scavenge the nutrients that were put out in the fall in that fertilizer. And so the same cover crop biomass test was revealing to us a significant portion of P and K were sequestered in that rye, which I'm confident is given back to that crop because that rye had melted back into the ground 30 days after the corn was up. But the thing that I think is really interesting here too is that for anybody who is spreading fall DAP, you know that 18% of how many pounds of product you put out there is nitrogen, right? It's diammonium phosphate. So there's an ammonia molecule out there that we typically, as an agronomist, would not take credit for the following spring. We just assume that the P's out there and it's going to stay there, but that nitrogen is probably lost because whatever water dynamics happen in between the fall and the following spring mean that that nitrogen is washed away. Well, I'm not so sure now if we're using cover crops that we should just discount that that nitrogen is gone, because if rye gets up and established robustly, and as that DAP molecule slowly dissolves and gets into the soil profile, I have to ask the question, is that nitrogen now being sequestered by those rye roots? Do we have to, essentially give up what would be 18 pounds of nitrogen on 100 pounds of DAP fall spread? So these are the types of questions I think we need to bring back to the table relative to your point that we can consider reducing fertilizer applications if we have confidence that the rye is actually sequestering what otherwise would have been lost.
And I think when that research or whatever we want to call it starts becoming more mainstream and people start accepting that as, yes, it works, I think that's when we're really going to start seeing, yeah, we don't need to knife in this anhydrous. We don't need to do all that. We can broadcast it, run a drill across with cereal rye, and as long as we get it to robustly establish before it gets set back by winter, by snow or frost, we can take that credit at a lot cheaper cost then ammonia or anhydrous or other forms of application like that.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think one of the things that we have to start to appreciate, in addition to everything we've discussed so far, is the degree of development that a little tiny baby rye plant that looks like almost nothing on the soil surface has underneath it. So you cast your gaze across a field that's just starting to wake up, mid-April up here, anyways, and you see that green carpet come to life, and then a couple weeks later you go back out there and you terminate that, and you go, my goodness, that short little rye plant, did it even do anything for me? Well, there's a couple things to be aware of that I think, again, using numbers can help us appreciate that a little bit more. If you're planting a bushel of rye per acre as a cover crop, that's 1 million seeds. So assume you get 90% germination of those seeds. You've got 900,000 little factories, little carbon pumps working on your behalf by the time that comes back to life the following spring. That's a lot of plants per acre doing a lot of work. Secondly, is that tiny little rye plant that might only be 3 or 4 inches tall mid to late April. You take a shovel and you dig that up and you turn it upside down. What you're going to find is a root system that is 10x the biomass of what you see coming out of the ground. And there have been circumstances where early May, I've gone out and I've scratched in between drilled rye rows on 7.5 inches, and I find intersecting roots significantly between those rows. Again, it doesn't sound like a big deal as we're talking about it, but it is a big deal when you start scratching around underground, because you find that the amount of area, soil surface, that these rye roots have penetrated underground is really quite mind-blowing. It really helps you appreciate that there's so much more going on below the ground than there is above ground, which helps you then feel pretty darn good that you did what you did in order to get that rye crop established.
Yeah, that's what one thing we've been trying to. We have a lot of sugar beets in our area, is work with sugar beet growers to establish that rye, but it's such, when you don't get anything in the fall, they want to see the fall growth. It's really kind of disheartening for them. But you go out in the spring and you dig up that plant that's only 1 inch or 2, and you just see the amount of root mass that it has. And like, that's keeping your soil in place. That's feeding your soil. That's waking up that biology in March or early April, instead of waiting for your soybean or corn crop to roots to grow for your biology to be active. I think that's another thing too that we miss on, is like having the cereal rye. Your biology sometimes in February will start in the soil because you have that cereal rye that's starting to grow. And the moment that cereal rye starts to grow and those roots become active, that's when your biology wakes up. And wouldn't you love your biology to be working 2 months before, 2 or 3 months before you start planting, to
Yeah.
get those start scavenging nutrients, getting that natural phosphorus and potassium activated, that your corn crop or your soybean crop can tap into right away, instead of waiting for it to establish. And you're kind of putting yourself behind the 8 ball then. I mean, I would love it if I could have a 2 to 3 month head start on most things, but I just think that's another part that we miss when it comes to biology and root systems and everything along that line.
Oh, you're spot on. And Jay Fuhrer of Minokan Farms, I think, said it best recently at a presentation he gave up in northern Minnesota at a soil health meeting. He's the guy that wrote the 5 soil health principles, and obviously what the things that he say take a lot of meaning. The one thing that he said that I really felt like had significant impact, and it was a great way to summarize the entire talk, is always be harvesting sunlight. That has really resonated with me. Always be harvesting sunlight. Most of our row crops up here in the north, they're in the ground for 4 or 5 months. And so we give up more than half of the year, if we're not planting covers, to not be harvesting sunlight. And in a winter like last year, where we touch 60 degrees almost every day of the winter, if that becomes more of the norm, we can harvest sunlight. I planted rye at my place here in between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And I came back in February, and that rye was out of the ground 3 inches high. I was harvesting sunlight outside of the row cropping season that I typically would not otherwise harvest. And I think that's a really big deal. Well, you go, well, what's the big deal? Why harvest sunlight? What's the value in doing that? Well, you harvest sunlight. Sunlight turns to carbon. Carbon's pumped back into the ground to feed the microbes, and it's those darn microbes that end up feeding your subsequent crop. So anything we can do to harvest sunlight, pump carbon into the ground, and feed microbes is going to be beneficial in the long run. So I just love that logic of always be harvesting sunlight, because it really kind of encapsulates the entire reason why we need to be doing this, because it's all about pumping more carbon into the ground to feed microbes.
For sure. Where do you think, as an agronomist, where do you think your field could do better in the worlds of soil health? Obviously, you're doing a great job. You have a passion for soil health, and that's taken you you've been able to take that passion and implement it in your daily life. But how do you think other agronomists, or where do you think other agronomists are missing when it comes to soil health?
Great question. This is a tough one to answer because I don't think the solutions are easy. They are easy in theory, but they're just hard practically. It always comes back to education and exposure. The most frequent questions that I hear from other colleagues, other agronomists, due to the fact they just don't have the experience with managing covers. And if they don't have the experience managing covers, they don't feel comfortable advising a farmer on how or why to get started doing it. So I firmly believe that soil health principles, things like covers and reasons why to minimize tillage and all the things that benefit the soil from doing so should be part of the curriculum in agronomy training. And I'm guessing there are probably soil health classes that are now part of agronomy programs, but I think they need to take a much bigger role, especially as farmers continue to adopt these practices. There's a demand for information out there on how to do things. There's a lot of curious farmers. Give these guys credit. I mean, they're open-minded and they're curious. They want to figure out a way to make this work. And therefore, they need good advisors with experience to help them take some of these ideas and put them into practice on the farm. I think so. It really comes back to education and awareness, and building a little experience on their own.
What do you think, if we had more educated agronomists in soil health and managing cover crops, do you think we'd see a more robust adoption and a greater step forward in more producers implementing these practices?
100%, absolutely. I certainly do. And the reason I can say that with such degree of confidence is that I get calls from farmers all the time that I don't consult for, that are asking questions about how do I do this. They may not be interested in hiring me to come and consult on their farm in a more traditional sense, but they do want a couple of questions asked about cover crops. And so that to me has been a strong signal to suggest that, yeah, if there were more advisors out there with more experience, we would see increased adoption across a lot more acres. And when you consider the fact that there's so many funding programs to help take some of the financial risk off the table for someone getting started, this becomes a no-brainer. There's no financial risk now because there's plans that pay more than what it costs to put the cover crop out there and terminate it. And so that when you take the financial risk off the table, all you're left with is really, how do I do this and just do it right? So I think the opportunity is incredible. I expect to see the adoption rate continue to go up exponentially. And as more and more advisors become experienced in coaching farmers on this, I just think that the sky's really bright as it relates to adoption of these practices.
That's great to hear. What's the biggest question you usually get from any of these producers asking when it comes to soil health practices?
Sure. I think the biggest question is, and the most important question is in regards to what's the right time to kill it? How do I terminate? How do I do this without negatively impacting the subsequent crop? Now, it's pretty rare for us to have cover crop alive when soybeans are planted, just because there's not a lot of covers planted in last year's corn going into soybeans. So really the risk is, how do I not negatively impact my corn crop? The biggest question is, when do I terminate this rye? And that's what we're trying to hone in up here, is trying to find that sweet spot. And obviously field conditions are going to dictate that too, because Mother Nature usually is not very agreeable in the first part of May.
Yeah.
But we are advising folks to take a more proactive and cautious approach, where if you've got one day and the rye is still short, get after it, get it terminated, remove that negative experience variable from the equation. Make sure you terminate the rye exactly when it needs to be done. Otherwise, you set yourself up for potential bad experience, and then probably don't come back to the well if that was your first experience. So, yeah, I'd say pretty confidently that the biggest question or concern we have is when to terminate the rye.
Awesome. Well, we touched on a lot. I appreciate you joining us, Joe. Where can folks reach you if they have any questions?
Yeah, I'm most active on Facebook. You can find me at Ailts Agronomy. That's AILTS. You feel free to reach out via Messenger, or just reply to one of my posts there, and I'd be happy to respond to you.
Awesome. And also, if you need us information, feel free to contact our office as well, and we'll be able to hook you up with Joe. Thanks again for joining us, Joe. It's been a great chat this morning, and we look forward to discussing more in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you much.